is the financial report. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Ian share his. Even though his slides have been incorporated into my presentation, his are in a wider format, which will make them easier to read because some of them have some small type. So he's going to present directly from his computer.
Thank you, Claire. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see here if this works okay. Can anyone see slide 2 right now, the 2020, with this table, the outline here?
I'm seeing 2020 Orienteering USA Annual General Meeting Financial Report.
Yeah, still on slide 1. There we go. Now it's 2.
Okay, we'll try this. I'll just leave the stay at a presenter view. Okay, so I'm going to try to give a quick overview of the financial report. Obviously, there's a lot of detail, but in the interest of brevity, we could easily spend 2 hours talking about this. So briefly, I'm going to present our current financial position, our 2020 year-to-date financial activity, a review of 2019's financial activity, and importantly, projections for 2021 and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who are unaware, I'm the VP Finance, and if you have any questions, you can reach me at ian.smith@orienteeringusa.org, and that contact information is also available on the website. So I think we certainly need to do a better job with transparency and making it clear to everyone what our financial position is. The statements are available in the Orienteering USA library, which is accessible from the OUSA website. That links you to a Google Drive. And if you follow this somewhat convoluted path into administrative, board, and finance, all of our statements of financial position from our accounting service, Jitasa, and our statements of financial activity are available there each month. Now, while that's strictly speaking true, I don't think this really is enough to satisfy transparency. So I'm going to try to do a better job making it available to everyone what our current situation is. These statements of financial position look like what you see on the right. Rather than presenting walls of text, I'm going to try to summarize them, but all the details are available if anyone wants to preview them or wants to go through them. So as of August 2020, our current assets amount to $414,000, of which the bulk of that, $367,000, is in our bank account in cash. We receive money from the OUSA endowment. This doesn't appear on our statements of financial position anymore. The OUSA endowment is a separate nonprofit entity. They have the endowment is approximately $350,000 in size, and they send, they're required to send 4% of the value of the endowment into OUSA's general operating fund each year. So that's between $12,000 and $14,000. The value of the endowment fluctuates a bit over time. Of our current assets, approximately $120,000 are restricted and board designated money for the teams. So our current unrestricted balance is approximately $290,000. By the end of the year, considering all our expenses, that will go down somewhat to probably about $250,000. To put this in a little bit of context, over the past 2 or 3 years, our total assets have been growing. Part of this is due to conservative budgeting, and part of it's due to just because you budget an expense at a particular time doesn't necessarily mean it'll happen in that year. So for example, some of the things that we budgeted in 2019 didn't end up being spent until 2020. Restricted and team funds, so the money available to the teams, has fluctuated at around $100,000 to $150,000. OUSA policy requires OUSA to maintain a balance of the total amount of board designated and restricted funds, as well as 3 months of our annual operating budget. So this in our current state amounts to maintaining a balance of around $200,000. And that's kind of a minimum. We'd like to have a little bit more in the event of, something that dramatically interfered with the functioning of Orienteering USA, like a pandemic. So it's always nice to have a little bit of a cushion. So I've drawn this little pink line to indicate we need to maintain a balance of above this much. But certainly we've I think partly due to healthy budgeting, our financial position has been improving over the past couple of years. In some sense, we don't want it to improve too much, because if money just sits in the bank account and doesn't do anything, then we're not really discharging our mission. But our current financial position is pretty sound. So 2020 year-to-date financial activity, it's been a bit of a down year due to the COVID pandemic, but because Orienteering USA receives a lot of its income at the beginning of the year from membership dues and club dues, this hasn't drastically affected income from 2020. The biggest impact is sanctioning fees. We were predicting some money from national events, and that money hasn't really come in. Our budget, which is here in this column, versus actual year to date in this right column, we're forecasting something like $25,000 of sanctioning fees, and we've actually received a little over $3,000 from the Navigator Cup. So our income shortfall for 2020 will probably be about $40,000 compared to what we budgeted. However, and sorry, to give this a little bit more context, this is a graph showing our sources of income. The 2020 budget is in blue, actual 2020 is in red, and actual 2019 for comparison is in gold. And as you can see, there were a bit more donations in 2019. Program income was considerably higher in 2019, but membership dues and club dues were basically the same, because those tend to happen early. 2020 year-to-date financial activity, our expenses, I've simplified it into a much smaller number of categories here. The actual statements of financial activity have like 40 or 50 different accounting codes, some of which are not immediately obvious or intuitive what they mean. So this is a bit of a simplification here. We were budgeting for 2020 to spend about $210,000, and we've spent considerably less than that. We've spent $88,000, $89,000. Partly due to the cancellation of elite competition. So our teams haven't been traveling, they haven't been doing training camps, and coaching has also been reduced. And also, there have been obstacles to implementing programming, and there hasn't been any travel for conferences. So these categories are not, they're a little bit fuzzy. I kind of had to put accounting codes into these buckets, so forgive me for the generalizations, but you can see the difference between the budget and our actual year to date in this bar graph here with blue versus red. So, coaching, we were expecting to spend a lot more on that. The elite teams, we designated money to the teams that they haven't really used, just because there hasn't been as much activity. And then, a lot of our programming, we haven't really been able to effectively discharge that. To give a little bit more context here, again, this is expenses for 2020 compared to the budget and 2019. Again, these categories are a little bit fuzzy just because the accounting codes do not often map to intuitive buckets. But here you see the elite athlete activity was considerably higher in 2019 compared to 2020. Some of our programming, hasn't really materialized yet, and coaching is also sort of down. So the big picture is that we've spent $53,000 less in 2020 than in 2019 at the same time. And this is actually a little bit, some of our expenses from 2019 ended up being deferred until 2020. So we've actually spent even less in 2020 relative to 2019 than would have been expected. In the interest of time, I'm just going to very briefly mention 2019's financial activity. So this is the budget from 2019 versus actual spending or income and spending for 2019. We received a bit more income in 2019 than we anticipated, chiefly in the form of restricted contributions. Everything else basically lined up with the expectations, sanctioning fees, membership dues, club dues being the biggest categories. It's relatively consistent year to year. The endowment also a source of income. 2019 expenses, again, these categories are a little bit fuzzy, and I think that's well, I'll get to that in just a minute, how the budget does not always lend itself to intuition. The key differences here between the budgeted amounts for 2019 and the actual amounts for 2019. National team spending was higher. This is a bit misleading because the national team spend a lot of restricted money that we didn't include in our budget because restricted money is not something the board. It's something we're aware of, but we don't. When we're budgeting our undesignated funds, it's not something we really consider. So this is not a surprising difference in the national teams. Club member programming, we budgeted a lot in 2019 and didn't actually end up spending it, but a lot of that was just moved to January and February of 2020. So the activity happened in 2019, but wasn't paid until 2020. So I also just want to mention our historical budgets from 2018 to 2020. The board has put a lot of emphasis in recent years on developing programming for clubs and membership, and it's still an ongoing challenge. It'd be really nice if we could write a check for orienteering growth or a massively enhanced orienteering schedule. Claire will get into some of our programming in greater detail, but the general trend of our budgets has been pretty consistent. Income predominantly comes from club dues and membership dues, with other money coming from donations and the endowment. But it's fairly stable, fairly consistent from year to year. 2021 likely to be an exception. And in expenses, administrative is kind of what I would call the keep the lights on budget. That's things like insurance and accounting costs, dues to organizations, things that we really have to pay to continue to exist as a federation. Board is kind of a catch-all for some contingency money, some travel to events. A key difference from 2019 to 2020 is we don't have Orienteering North America in 2020, but we're moving some of that into additional programming to try to do more communications. But yeah, in general, the budgets have been fairly consistent. So the sort of elephant in the room, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said, the pandemic hasn't really affected our income because the income tends to happen early in the year. However, it's dramatically going to affect 2021. This is a simplified table of income sources. I've sort of lumped a lot of things that are small. So these are the sort of biggest categories. As you saw from our historical budgets, it's been fairly consistent from year to year. This column here is the 2020 budget for each of these categories. Again, most of the money coming from membership dues, club dues, and sanctioning fees, with donations and endowment proceeds making up sort of the lion's share of the rest. Actual 2020 is, considerably reduced, especially sanctioning fees. In 2021, I've made some assumptions here because we need to, kind of make some intelligent guesses about how much money we're going to have in 2021. So I projected no money from sanctioning fees in 2021. Like, we don't know when we're going to be able to start holding national ranking events again. I hope it's soon. Of course, the North American Championships are scheduled for August, but it's very difficult to anticipate exactly when we're going to be able to do that. Similarly, club dues, about 80% of our money from club dues comes from local events. I don't know what, I know some clubs have been holding local events, some clubs have been holding, socially distanced, print your own map, do your own orienteering. But for the purposes of making intelligent projections for our budget, I assumed we would be getting no money from local events. I also assumed that we wouldn't see a decline in membership, and that I don't know that that's necessarily a well-founded assumption. It's possible because we haven't really had orienteering in 2020 that club members won't renew their memberships, and so club dues will see a hit. Similarly, not necessarily if there aren't national ranking events, maybe not everyone will renew their OUSA memberships. So I think it's reasonable to project about a shortfall of about $100,000 for 2021 income compared to 2020. That said, that's offset a lot by a reduction in expenses in 2020. So I think in some sense, if we return to normalcy at some point in 2021, we can think of the income from 2020 being spent in 2021 instead. But over the next couple months, the board and the finance committee will be making choices about our budget. The budget has a lot of structure to it. These are numbers from 2020 for reference, again, simplified into a number of categories just to make it intuitive. Kind of the minimum we would need to spend to continue to exist as an organization would be in the neighborhood of $80,000 to $90,000 to kind of keep the lights on budget, pay for things like insurance and dues and accounting and so on. That said, because our financial position is pretty sound and we have, about $150,000 in unrestricted funds more than our minimum requirements, I don't think we'll need to necessarily make draconian programming cuts. The board will be making some important prioritization decisions over the next, over the next 2 months. It's also worth noting that because the national teams didn't really travel, we may not be able to, or it may be reasonable to not make a similar board designated allocation to the national teams because they can spend what we allocated in 2020 and 2021. Finally, I want to mention that improving our transparency reporting is a big priority for us. The bare minimum, of course, is posting statements of financial position and activities to the library. As I mentioned, the chart of accounts, which is the list of accounting codes corresponding to each source of income and expense, is a bit counterintuitive. And one of the things that my predecessor, Pat Meehan, and our accounting firm, Jitasa, and really everyone wanted to do is update our chart of accounts to make it more intuitive, both for us and for our accounting firm, Jitasa, so they know what all these things mean. Updating that chart of accounts will simplify the interpretation of bookkeeping. Similarly, I wrote the budget in 2019 and 2020, and I didn't really map it to the chart of accounts, to try to make it intuitive and understandable to board members. But that means that our accounting firm, doesn't really understand what each of the categories mean. So going forward, our budget will use the chart of accounts, and I think that'll make it easier to see at a glance what our current financial situation is. How much have we spent of what we budgeted for the year, how much income has come in, and so on. And if you're curious about this, if you'd like to be updated, I suggest you subscribe to BoardNet. It's an email list relating to board conversations. But we're definitely making a priority to keep everybody better informed about our financial situation going forward. So to summarize, the pandemic has severely affected 2020. Incomes, about $25,000 lower than expected. Expenses, nominally they're $55,000 lower than expected, but because some of those expenses in 2020 are actually carryover from 2019, it's really more like $80,000 below expectation. We have unrestricted assets. We project to have unrestricted assets at the end of the year of about $250,000, which is well over a minimum requirement of $50,000 and kind of a nice to have requirement of $100,000. And as I said, the pandemic is probably going to shift a lot of expenses, or income from 2020 will go to pay expenses in 2021. And we're going to make conservative budget choices to make sure that whatever the situation is in 2021, that OUSA will continue to exist and provide services to everyone. So thank you for your attention. Does anybody have any questions? Sorry, I wasn't able to see the chat. I don't know if there
Yeah, the only thing I've seen in chat is someone who had difficulty seeing the slides. I'm not sure why they weren't apparently going through the slides for that person, but the slides are also available on the AGM site on the website. they're included in the overall slide deck, so you can download that and look at the slides there as well.
Certainly, it's a lot to go over in 10, 15 minutes. But if anyone has any questions, please email me and I'd be happy to discuss this with everyone. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ian.